All right, now here we go with Lecture 5, Consumer and Producer Surplus. The usual stuff here, we'll just kind of talk about all this stuff. We're moving along, burning through the chapters. We're going to slow down quite a bit in the next couple of classes. But we are, Chapter 6, I think, is what corresponds with what I'll talk about today. Heading into Chapter 7, it looks like our exam, which is on the horizon, right? It's appearing there on the horizon. It'll probably be something like chapters 1 through 8. I have 4 homeworks up there. They're quick, they're easy, but they keep things in your mind here. I do have to do verification of attendance this week, and I think I said registration for Top Hat would be sufficient evidence. So hopefully you've gotten that done. I think maybe I'm preaching to the choir here, as it looks like something like 90 people were signed up. We did have a tentative date for our exam. We'll get to that in a second. But reminder, no class Thursday, right? College is closed. We don't have class next Tuesday, right? And then, I'm not going to be here the following Thursday. So we're kind of out of commission for a week and a half. It's really stressing me out. It makes me nervous. So I actually concocted what I think is going to be a neat and fun exercise for you that I'll remind you about maybe midweek next week. And you can kind of do that on your own, and it'll be a little bit of a way to keep up with what's going on in class. So here's our calendar, right? So today is Lecture 5, closed, no classes, and then class canceled. And so you can kind of see here we're sort of gearing up for our first exam around this date. And maybe what we'll do is we'll regroup on the 24th, Lecture 6, and see what happens there. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the exam. I was trying to look for it on the syllabus, but is it open notes?
The exam, you know what, by the time we get there, it's going to be crystal clear how the exam is going to work and even what's going to be on it. I'm glad you asked that, because typically what I do is I give you a practice exam that I try to make, well, it's not identical, but I try to make it as similar to the actual exam as possible. I hand that out, you look at it, and then we'll review it pretty thoroughly on the, on the class right before the exam. And the idea, once again, is, I see this with, maybe it's kind of lucky, I have 3 kids who have gone through school. Almost all of their anxiety is, when it comes to exams, is about format and timing and all that stuff, and not so much about content. And so what my goal is to have you not even worry about what the exam is going to look like and how long it's going to be and all that stuff. Just worry about what's on it, right? Knowing the material. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping to accomplish in the build-up to the exam. So maybe, and of course, I've been at this a while. There's a logistical thing here where I have to, it's only me here and our TA, who I'm hoping to kind of bring in the next, shortly. But I have this logistical problem where I have to get 100 students in and out of the classroom in, an hour and 15 minutes. So that obviously, you think about the mathematics of that. How long can an exam be? I have to be, pretty concise in how I put it all together. But it'll be clear, is my simple answer. No open notes, right? You gotta know your stuff. No calculators either, right? I'll say that for the first time. Anyway. Yeah.
On the top end, just the assignment until March 5th.
Yes.
They're all same day. Is it correct?
Yes. Okay. So good question. Also on the Top Hat stuff, you'll notice that the homework all has the same due date, right? Which is March 5th. I make that right around the date of the exam. The idea is that you have up until the exam to work on it. You can do them multiple times. I keep only the highest score, right, your best effort at the homework. But the idea is you can continue to look at it and do the problems over and over again. I actually have a pretty good cadre of practice problems as well, which I will make available in the lead up there. Right. Yeah.
I was doing the homework. I was doing the homework for it.
Uh-huh.
We had to do the graph.
Good.
I was having trouble.
Okay.
With the GeoGebra.
Oh, okay, GeoGebra, yeah.
The graphing.
Uh-huh.
If that's something we could probably review one of these classes.
Okay, yeah, you know what? That's a good idea. We'll take a crack at some of that stuff. But that's, won't be on the exam or anything. But good question. All right, I'm going to have to get moving here. Okay, and so we started out the class just by talking about this thing I called comparative statics. By the way, it was a miserable tech failure last time. My recording did not work from the lecture. If you remember, we had some camera stuff going on there. So maybe a little bit more of an expansive review than before, than usual. But we talked about supply and demand, right? How we can put those together, which shows us a relationship between quantities demanded and supplied and price, right? The good news was we could also show changes in other things by shifting the curves around, right? We could show what happens if people's tastes change, how that might change demand. We can talk about how technological change or even weather events, right, change supply, right? And in this way, we can kind of shift around the curves and get some idea as to how equilibrium things like prices and quantities change. More on that in a second, right? But that's kind of the idea, is that we can shift these curves around to sort of understand the machinations of a market, right? So one way we might do this is, maybe I'll just pick two of these because we're a little bit slower here than we usually are today. But I talk about my first example. I don't know if you can see it over the board here. How is the market for oranges impacted by heavy frosts in Florida? So by impacted, what I mean is, how does the equilibrium price change, right? Or price and quantity change? So the way you might attack this as an economist is you kind of start out by just drawing a standard supply and demand graph, price and quantity like this, and then you can draw an initial market position, demand and supply. Here's our initial equilibrium. I could call it P1 maybe, and Q1. That's where our orange market starts the experiment here. And then we say, well, what happens in our market is there are heavy frosts in Florida, right? So what does this do, or how might this affect the market? Well, frosts are something that really impact the supply, right? That's really about growing oranges, and it seems like that should make it more difficult, right? Should make it harder to supply oranges. And the way we would show that is we would say, well, now we should see fewer oranges supplied at any given price as before. So we could shift back the supply curve like this to reflect this new reality, right? And at the end of the day, what happens is we have a new market equilibrium, and we can kind of say, okay, well, this shift in supply is the cause of now higher orange prices and lower quantities exchanged, right? So call that P2 and Q2 like that. So that's a very simple example of comparative statics, right? And maybe I will think about this market for apples when the price of pears go down. I'm going to do three of these because I like the number 3 is a little bit more maybe interesting. So I apologize, I can't quite make this as big as my previous one. P, Q. Once again, we can just start by drawing a demand and supply like this, right? And then we would say P1, Q1. Okay, market for apples when the price of pears goes down. This is tricky, right? How do pears and apples interrelate? Well, these are things that you buy, right? They're both kind of handheld fruits. Is that a category of consumer product? I don't know. But they're similar in that way, right? You can pack a pear or an apple for lunch or whatever. We might think of them as substitutes, right? Now, when the price of a substitute good, right, something I buy instead of the good in question, goes down, I'm more likely to buy that instead of the thing that we're talking about, right? So we might expect that when the price of pears falls, people demand less apples, right? And so what would that do in our market here? We would expect maybe that would shift back the demand for apples, right? And you can see what we would expect to have happen here, P2 and Q2, right? We would expect a lower price in the Apple market and a lower quantity traded, other things equal. Okay, so one other thing, and this is like where I just kind of start, I like to ramble sometimes, it's my class, so I can do that. You'll see here my last example is the market for live concerts when music is easier to download and share. This is a complicated problem, right? Nowadays people don't download and share music anymore, but this was a big thing back in the early 2000s, right? Where everybody, I sometimes say that my generation, I'm the only one that's really had to buy my record collection like 3 or 4 times. I used to have LPs when I was a kid, and then there was cassette tapes, right? And then CDs came along, and now everything is online. So I've had to re-buy my record collection 3 or 4 times here. But this was a big thing back in the 90s into the 2000s. Everybody was swapping music and sharing. Even before that, you could do that with cassette tapes. But it really got rolling in the early 2000s. And this changed the music industry in ways that nobody really thought it would. And so I have one particular story in mind here about all this. So go back to 1980, right? 1982, 1983. In those days, there was a lot of great live music, some of which I went and saw. The first concert I ever saw, Iron Maiden, 1984 at the Worcester Centrum. Be that as it may, at the time there were also a lot of bands out there that were purely studio bands, right? So you think about like Steely Dan or Toto, right? Just studio musicians. Now, long story short, as we move into the 80s and 90s, these sorts of bands kind of disappeared, right? And you can maybe think about why this was the case. It became impossible for musicians to really make money just by making records and selling them, right? Really what a record became was kind of a support for a giant tour that you would go on, right? And in fact, if you go out and, it's not a giant surprise when you see, bands that were popular in the 70s and 80s out there still touring today. In fact, Steely Dan, maybe the quintessential studio band, has a tour, right? They go to like whatever the place is out there on Jones Beach, right? And so you might sort of say that one of the consequences of this was that musicians had to change the way they packaged their product. And one of the consequences of the of all of this was that one consequence, here's quantity, here's price, demand, and supply. You might say that, well, let's see here. What I'm talking about would seem to suggest, if we're talking about live concerts, a shift out, right, in the supply of concerts in general. And of course, you have to kind of think a little bit about what the goods here are. I'm going to help you do that in a second with some other stuff. But we might expect that this would increase the quantity of concerts out there, Q1 to Q2, and that the price would fall, right? Now, you might say, well, wait a minute, Baker, it seems like concerts are really expensive. My daughter wanted to go see Olivia Rodrigo, and if you want to get a ticket to go see that in Madison Square Garden, turns out it's quite a bit of money, thousands of dollars almost, right? But at the same time, you can sort of say, well, there was another change as concerts got more frequent, S1 and S2. Well, musicians also spent a lot more time in, making the shows like really pop and, more theatrics and all this stuff, better advertising. And so these things at the same time increased the demand for concerts, right? So you might say that at the same time there was a shift out, right, in the demand for concerts. So in the end, you can say these two stories are consistent with, higher priced concerts because they have higher quality or better advertising or whatever, and there's a lot more of them at the same time. So you might say these two things caused an increase in the demand for live music. It's kind of fun to do, to break things down like that. That last one got a little crazy, and I usually like to keep things to shifting one thing at a time, as I'll say in a second. We'll get to that in a moment. But oftentimes you kind of like to move both of these, both things at the, to get the full effect here. The world is actually complicated. So I have an eraser here. Yeah. Okay. So one thing I'm thinking I'm going to have you do in the missing week, right, that we have coming up, is try to do something like this yourself, and do it in a way that you might do it if you're an economist, which is, maybe think about something that's off the beaten path or not obvious, right? And in fact, that's kind of what happens down here, is that, at the end of the day, it's sometimes hard to make predictions about the future, more on that in subsequent classes. And oftentimes things turn out exactly the opposite of the way you thought they would. For example, back in the 1980s, there were people who were commonly predicting that live events in general were going to disappear, right? We wouldn't have them anymore. So people were very worried about Broadway, right? People were worried about live concerts, even live sporting events. Well, it turns out today these things are more popular than they ever were, right? Which is kind of an interesting thing to think about. So, you got to have a slide in your notes. Here's my slide, just kind of describing for you how a demand shift works, right? And of course, I'm reminding you, I got a little carried away there with my lecture. I'm reminding you here that some of the vocabulary we use for this is, when we're moving along a curve, we think about that as changes in quantity supplied or demanded. A change in demand itself is a shift in the curve, right? And a shift in the demand schedule. So what I'm thinking I'm going to have you do next week, it's so fun to talk about these things. I kind of forgot this was here, but maybe we'll pick this up after the break here. But it's kind of interesting to think about some, now that I'm going to do it anyway. And you can read about this. I'll quickly tell you what this is about. It'll give you something to think about. Around the holidays, there are certain specialized products that we often buy at those times, right? And it turns out that these are kind of nice little pieces of detective work if you're an economist to think about. So the price of turkey, right? You're going to buy a giant turkey, and cook it and all that stuff. Does anybody know what happens to the price of turkey around Thanksgiving? Does it go up? Does it go down? It turns out, right, the price of turkey, right, it actually falls, right, just before Thanksgiving, right? The price of turkey, as it happens, goes down a little bit right before Thanksgiving. And you might say, well, why is that? Everybody wants a turkey, right, around Thanksgiving. That should be a big shift out in demand, right? Well, it turns out that there's not only a big shift out in demand around Thanksgiving, there's also an enormous shift out in supply, right? That's when all the turkeys come onto the market. So those two things together create a giant, picture it in your mind here, because I know I'm moving fast. They create a giant increase in the quantity traded in the market, but the price doesn't change that much relative to what it would usually be. Yes?
Wouldn't it be because it's complementary?
Oh.
So you getting other things as well?
Okay, so this is a sophisticated thing. This is another point. Great point. Turkey is actually also what we call a loss leader, right? Well, what does that mean? It turns out that grocery stores, and when we talk about strategic aspects of pricing, what they like to do around Thanksgiving is sell you a really cheap turkey to get you in the store where you buy all the other stuff, right? The mashed potatoes and the gravy and all of that, right? So, and that's where they make the money. So this is kind of a loss leader, right? And at other times they do, other businesses do this as well. So for example, the President's Day television sale is kind of like that too, get you in the store.
What they do, like supermarkets in my areas, they'll be like, spend $250, you get a free Butterball turkey.
Okay. Yeah, so there's stuff like that. That's get in there, and so that's a loss leader. Now, that's a great way to segue into the next thing, Thanksgiving. Valentine's Day, coming up fast, right? It's Saturday, yes. And around Valentine's Day, everybody likes to buy roses or flowers, right? Now, it turns out the price of flowers typically goes up, I think, around Valentine's Day. And you might sort of think about this. Again, of course, there's a shift in supply and demand, but here the shift in demand maybe outweighs the shift in supply. Why do they get so expensive? Well, for exactly the same things we've been talking about. No, thank you. But also because, you know, if you take a look at this article, you can get some of the ideas that it's not quite as easy to expand the supply of flowers around Thanksgiving, but they're also not really a loss leader, right? That is to say, you don't go into the flower shop and buy a whole bunch of things with your roses, right, when you're buying this. Unlike Thanksgiving, where you have to have all the trappings of the meal. So it's kind of fun to do this stuff and think about these sorts of things. So next week, I'm going to package this up as a full-blown exercise, and you'll get an email from me. Make sure you check your email and all that stuff. And what I'm going to do is just have you go out and find a market. The weirder, the better, right? You can probably tell I like these strange markets. So far, we have flowers, we have turkeys, we talked about snow plows and cheese, right? So the stranger, the better, because it's kind of attention grabbing. And what I want you to do is just take a look at some prices. I'll show you an example here in a second. Find an anomaly on the graph and then try to explain it as simply as possible with the supply and demand diagram. So maybe I can do this here. Let me try to look at I'll see what happens. I'll try Google here. Yeah, you can, for this thing, you can use AI. I kind of want you to use AI. We'll get there in a second. What am I doing? Okay. So I say go to this link. If you want to go somewhere else to sort of do this, that's fine too. This is my first chance to introduce you to the FRED database, which is the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis runs a nice data site where it has just about everything on here. And so you can see here, you can find series for 1,685 or so prices, right? And what I want you to do is something like the following. So I planned a little bit ahead here, and I kind of just browsed through this list. I kind of clicked through the bottom until what I was looking for was, if you see something like this, oh, this is a good one, coffee. I was looking down here to see how complete the series was, right? And once I found one that was complete, I just kind of took a look at it, right? My particular one was, what did I say over here on my slide? It was soft tub margarine, U.S. city average. Why would you pick that? Well, I learned something by doing it. I'll show you here in a second. Soft tub margarine city average. All right, so that comes up. All right, now here's what the series looks like over time, an average across cities. Later in the class, we're going to learn about how you actually build these indices, how you make them out of prices. So it's not great. I mean, it's a little spotty, as data often is through these times. But then if you look at this series, you can kind of, of course, it's like any price, it bounces all over the place. But you can kind of see some big trends here. So there's a big spike here in 2008 to 2010. By the way, these bars are recessions, right? These are general bad times economically. That was the housing crisis thing. Maybe more interesting for our purposes is the fact that the price of margarine just kind of fell, right? It almost dropped it fell by almost a third between 2014 and 2019, right? Who knew, right? Well, let's see. Let's ask Gemini what happened here. Why did the price of margarine fall from 2014 to 2019? Gemini, don't let me down. I'm normally a chat GPT. Okay, let's see here. The decline in margarine prices between these years was primarily driven by a perfect storm, ooh, I like that, of falling production costs and a significant shift in consumer behavior. while many pantry staples grew more expensive during this era, margarine became cheaper because the ingredients used to make it were abundant, and the people who usually bought it were switching to butter. Oh, well, hey, isn't that cool? We just saw this in this price series, right? And we now have a recipe for kind of doing some of the stuff that I just did, right? It looks like we have a supply shifter, aka the ingredients to make it became abundant, right? At the same time, people became less inclined to buy margarine, right, which is made from vegetable oils. I guess people have always sort of felt it was unhealthy, but this seems to say that butter, right, became in higher demand because maybe people realized it wasn't as unhealthy as people used to think. So drawing this out, we might say we start in 2014 with the demand and supply curve like this, right? P1, Q1, and then we say, all right, well, what changed in this period of time, right, between, oh, they even have a word for it, the butter is back trend down there, number 2. What changed in this period of time? Well, it became easier to make margarine, right? So we might expect that would shift out the supply of margarine, right? At the same time, people became less inclined to buy it, right? So we would get a shift in demand, right? People want to buy less, that's a shift to the left or back of demand. It's easier to make, that's a shift out in supply. You put these two things together, and you can see here you get a big drop, right, in the price of margarine over time. So that would be a nice way of explaining the trend in the data, right? Maybe not all the little bumps, but just the overall trend. And of course, what you could do if you wanted to find some additional evidence for this is you could say, well, we just looked at the price. We didn't even look at the quantity, but we might want to be interested in what the quantity is doing there, right? Of course, one day when you finish your economics major, maybe you get a master's from Hunter, all that stuff, and then you become the chief economist at some business. You know, this will be your job every day, is sort of, you know, people will ask, well, what's going to happen to the price of this? Or what's going to happen to the price of that? Or why is the price of something else changing, right, at the rate that it is? Anyways, let's fire up the old attendance for the day. And I will try to do my usual thing here as we now, how am I doing on time? I feel like I've just been talking a lot. No, I'm doing pretty good. I know I just, come on, Top Hat. Okay, things are taking longer than expected. I'll come back to that, but everybody be ready. You know what, maybe what I'll do is this. And this. Oops, not that. Just the Mac stuff, you know. Oh, there we go. Oh. That wasn't what I had in mind. There we go. That's more what I had in mind. I'm figuring it out slowly but surely here. My internet connection seems to be slow. Good. Hopefully. Yeah, I know. Let's try this. Okay. Anyways, I'll keep moving, and we'll come back to that in a second. All right, that's a good point to kind of segue, because that was a lot of review about supply and demand. Last time we did something maybe a little bit more important, in that we started to read into our supply and demand diagrams a little bit, right? So if you'll remember, what we did was we, A, attached a geometric concept to our supply and demand diagram, and we thought about this thing here, these shapes here, which was a total expenditure rectangle, right? We observed, put another way, that this quantity here on the horizontal axis, well, that was Q, that's quantity exchanged. The quantity on the vertical axis is P. If you multiply P times Q, you get the area of the rectangle, right, circumscribed by these two things, and that's price times quantity is also the total expenditure on the good. Oh, look at that. Top Hat's starting to heat up a little bit, hopefully. Okay, and then what we did, B, right, I started a list, so I have to add at least 2 items, right? A was we have the geometry there. B, we then attached some significance to that, right? In our example where we talked about the market for illicit drugs, we said, okay, well, why do we care about this area as a society? Well, we felt that it was a good way to gauge how important drugs were or how much destruction they were causing for our society. In particular, larger rectangles, bad, right? And we then parlayed this into a full understanding of, you know, what policies might do. Well, not maybe a full understanding, but at least a well-organized understanding. All right, now Top Hat's making me mental here, so I'm going to try this. What do they say the definition of insanity is? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? Okay, well, we'll see how it works. If we don't get attendance in, that'll be okay. So anyways, we also thought about how policies changed when, I guess the nature of our problem changed when demand was steep or flat or all those things, right? So we saw in particular that, all right, to hell with Top Hat. We'll try it again. Oop. If it works, it works. We'll just... I forgot what I was just saying, but we also factored in the slope of the graphs, and we saw how different policies changing, which amounted to changing around supply, how they impacted the problem. Okay. And you can kind of go back and look at those lecture notes if you want to revisit that example. It's kind of fun. So what we want to do, though, well, I guess we can revisit it now. Right? You remember quickly when demand was flat, shifting back supply made the rectangle small. So that would be like kind of the war on drugs type policy. When demand was steep, legalization or shifting out supply, as we reckoned it, made the rectangle small. And so we had this general idea that, you know, how different sorts of policies worked. And in the end, we saw that, you know, maybe there's a certain logic to these, the registered addiction type policies, right? Where you make it hard for first time or recreational people to be in the market, right? But you make it easier for those who are addicted to get their drugs. So that was kind of a neat application, and, you know, maybe I'll round it out by just saying, in the end, we were able to do this because we attached some significance to geometric aspects of this diagram. So what we're going to do is, you know, that's a little bit specific. Of course, I'd like you to remember that you can calculate expenditures by looking at P times Q. But we're going to push this a little bit farther, this logic that there's important things about the geometry of our graph that aren't immediately obvious. But once we recognize how it works, our instrument here, our supply and demand graph, will turn into a much more powerful tool than we might have thought, right? So pursuant to that, what we're going to do is define a couple of new terms here. I'm going to, let's try this again. I know the silence is, it's not great to just keep pausing and interrupting and all that stuff. We'll define a couple new terms, right, with a, you know, once again with an idea towards better understanding the geometry of the diagrams. Marginal benefit and marginal cost, right? So there's a couple things I'd like to say about this. First of all, the word marginal, it's not like margarine, but it's actually a word we use quite a bit in economics, and it's maybe a little bit off the beaten path. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that word, margin, marginal. Marginal benefit. Whenever you see the word marginal, suffice it to say, for the purposes of this slide, we're talking about additional something. So we would say that your marginal benefit is the additional benefits you derive from consuming something, right? Consuming an additional unit, right? Or an additional small amount. You might think about it that way. So, for example, we could talk about my marginal benefits from consuming a coffee, right? Usually we'd like to say, well, or usually you'd like to know, if you're going to talk about that, how many coffees I've already had, right? So we can talk about the marginal benefits I get from consuming one coffee, given I haven't had any. We can also talk about the marginal benefits I get from consuming a coffee, given I've already had 3 today, right? It's important that we talk about how much you've already had when we're talking about what you get from an additional consumption, a consumption of an additional unit. We can also use this term for costs, right? How much additional costs will you incur in producing an additional unit of something? So think back to my bottled water example, right? Where we talked a little bit about how, if a firm was already producing 1,000 bottles of water a day, how much it would cost to produce another bottle in that position, instead of if they started at a position where they were producing nothing and then decided to produce a unit. We argued that those two things were different, right? Because the costs increase as you do more of something. Well, maybe you sort of read between the lines when I was talking about marginal benefits. Well, assume kind of the opposite for that, right? That as you consume more of something, the additional benefits you derive fall. So we'll try this again. I'm hoping it'll work this time. Oh, there we go. Good. So having gotten that going, maybe I can do this. That didn't work very well. Oh, there it is. I'm not a Mac user, so I apologize for my fumbling around here. But I'm figuring it out, right? There we go. Oop. Need a little bit more. There we are. Okay, so there we go. Oh, you got pretty good at this already. I can see 57, 71, okay. So that's marginal, right? Marginal costs, marginal benefits. Okay, so why do we care about this, or why even bother introducing this term, right? Well, we would think that the maximal amount you would ever pay for anything is your marginal benefit, right? So when you decide, this is a consequence, by the way, of rationality. When you decide to buy something like a cup of coffee, an economist would sort of, you don't actually do this way, but you behave the kind of like you do. You'd say, okay, well, I buy a cup of coffee, what am I going to get out of it, right? What am I going to get out of it in satisfaction? I don't know, $5, let's say, right? If the price is $2, right, I'll buy a cup of coffee. I drink the coffee down and, I get my $5 in benefits at a cost of only $2 to myself. By the way, that gives me something like a surplus, right? A satisfaction surplus of $3, right? 5 what I get minus 2 what I paid, right? Now, maybe you can then sort of think about I have $6 here in my example. Let's go with that, right? Coffee, after all, is expensive at some of these boutique places around here. Suppose I derive instead $6 from consuming a cup of coffee. Well, then you might say, I buy the coffee when the price goes below that, right? Because I'm getting $6 in benefits, right? And I'm paying something less out, right? So, great, right? But you might ask the question, well, Baker, why just buy 1 cup of coffee then? That's my example. I kind of slipped that past you. Why don't I just buy 5 cups of coffee right then if my benefits are 6? From consuming, if the price is $5.50, I should buy as much coffee as I possibly can if my benefits are 6. Well, the answer to that question is we typically imagine that as you consume something, you get satisfied, right? So, and that's a pretty simple explanation. I buy my coffee at, it costs $5. I buy it because it benefits me at $6. I consume it, and what happens then is the benefits I would get from additional coffee go down, right? The way we would say it in economics is my marginal benefits decrease. I become satiated or satisfied, right? And we imagine that this is typically true, right? Marginal benefits are decreasing as you consume more and more and more of something, right? So we call this the law of diminishing marginal utility. Utility is just our fancy word for benefits. And we think about this as characterizing how consumers work, right? As you do more of something, the benefits you receive from each additional unit fall, right? You still get benefits, mind you, right? I'm going to have another cup of coffee today, but it won't be as good as my first one. I'll still like it, but not as much as I liked that first coffee I had, right? So we're not going to say that much more about this, but I'll get into some of the implications in a second here. But this is a giant subject if you wind up taking principles of micro or even intermediate micro, right? And that's my coffee example here. So why marginal? You might say, well, why not just call it additional benefits or something like that? Or, why have this jargon? Indeed, that's probably one of the most disappointing things about going to college and taking classes in different fields is everybody has these difficult names for simple ideas, right? Economics is no exception. Why marginal? And I've mentioned I teach history of economic thought. And so we dig into some of these things as we go through the class. So it was a term originally coined by this fellow by the name of Alfred Marshall, a British economist. He was writing in the 1880s, around that time. Maybe wrote what you could call the first economics textbook. He was a great mathematics student, right? Knew his natural sciences and all that. And the term marginal was in pretty wide use in those days in physics and mainly physics, but other in mathematics. And it was basically, it referred to how one thing changed when you changed something else a little bit, right? So maybe if you've taken a calculus class, it's a derivative, right? It's how x changes when y changes, right? Or usually it's how y changes when x changes. But we took that term and said, okay, well that works for us. How much do you get in additional benefits when you consume an additional unit of something, given you've already consumed some amount? And so Marshall just kind of ported that term from those sciences into economics, right? But you can see here, maybe the two things I would stress about this is marginal benefits depend upon how much you've already had, right? And measure the additional increment you will get if you consume more, right? So you have to kind of know those two things to really assess it. So I have another example here. As if coffee wasn't a great enough example, we'll go with pizza. We have a fellow named Jacob, and you can maybe think about how someone's marginal benefits would change from consuming pizza as they consume 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 slices of it, right? So I put in some numbers here just to kind of show you, there's this thing I call max WTP. What do I mean by that? I mean maximum willingness to pay, right? What is that? That's the most someone would ever pay, in our case Jacob, would ever pay for a slice of pizza. So how would I read this table? I'd say, well, when Jacob isn't consuming pizza, he's not getting any satisfaction or any benefit from it. Should he consume one slice, if I give him a slice, he gets about $8 in satisfaction in that, right? Well, as economists, we would then say the most he would ever pay for a slice of pizza, if he was walking by the pizza place and was hungry, and he saw the price was $9, he would say, I'm not buying that, right? Why not? My maximum willingness to pay is $8, right? That's the satisfaction I'll get. $9, I'd rather have the $9 than the $8 in pizza satisfaction. If the price fell to $7, now Jacob says, all right, well, I'll buy that slice. I get $8 in satisfaction at a cost of $7 to me, right? But I'm only going to have one slice. That'll be enough at that price. The price fell to $4, or let's say $3, Well, now Jacob says, let's see, ooh, I'm going to get 3 slices, right? How did Baker figure that out? Well, he said, well, let's see, the first slice will give Jacob $8 in satisfaction, right? But then he's a little bit satisfied. So his willingness to pay or his benefit for the next slice goes down to 6. 6 is still, however, greater than 3, right? So he'll buy that second slice and earn $3 of satisfaction from that. Yes? Now satisfaction falls even more. He's getting a little full maybe, but you can still see the third slice gives him $4 in additional benefits given he's consumed the first 2. So he'll buy that as well. But after that, his satisfaction then goes below the price and he stops buying slices. Okay? I kind of slid an interesting little thing past you there, right? When the price was high, $7, how many units did Jacob buy? 1, right? When the price was low, $3, how many slices did he buy? 3, right? So low price, more purchases. High price, fewer purchases. It kind of falls out of this idea that we have marginal benefits that are decreasing, right? Put another way, we have a theoretical foundation for why people buy more things at lower prices. The law of demand. Cool, right? It's kind of a neat little theoretical justification for that. Okay, so once again, this will get even more interesting now that we've sort of constructed this little theory. We might sort of step back and think about this as interested observers. Maybe we don't know these details about Jacob. In fact, you almost never know these things about people, right? I don't know what any of your willingness to pay for coffee is, right? How might I actually figure it out? Well, one thing I might do is I might just fire up a coffee pot here and start selling you coffee, right? $4. Who wants a cup of Baker's Premium Coffee, right? Some of you would buy it, some of you wouldn't. In both cases, I would learn something about your valuation, right? If you bought a cup, you value it at more than the price. If you don't, you value it at less than the price, right? So when I look at how many slices Jacob buys, right, at each of these prices, I learn, right, not only his willingness to pay for the slices, I in effect learn his marginal benefits because the two are one and the same, right? When I observe that Jacob buys no slices when the price is 10, right, and he buys 1 slice when the price goes below 8, say it's $7.50 or $7.99 or whatever, I now know that his valuation is somewhere between 10 and $7.99, right? We don't know it's exactly 8, but I figured that out just by observing what he does and assuming that he's rational. So one way we might put all this together is we would, you can kind of put it on this chart here. And, I'm just kind of using what Jacob does at these various prices as kind of a lower bound. But we might even add it, sort of break it into these things. And this slide should serve to remind you that that marginal benefits and total benefits are 2 different things, right? Marginal benefits are going down, right? But they're still positive. Total benefits we get by kind of adding up the marginal benefits, kind of like the following here. So when Jacob buys a slice at a price of 8, his marginal benefit is 8 or just above, right? Well, that means he's getting a total benefit of 8 from pizza, right? When the price goes down to 6, Jacob buys 2 slices, right? His marginal benefit from that second slice, the additional benefits are 6, but the totals are then 8 plus 6, right? He gets 8 from the first, 6 from the second. $14 would be his total benefits from consuming pizza. The third, he gets 4, so on and so forth. Hopefully you can kind of see how it works here, right? You can add up these marginal benefits to get the totals. Graphically speaking, we could even do it this way, right? So what am I doing on this graph? Well, you can see here I've just arranged his marginal benefits as these bars and maybe drawn a rough line through them, right? So now when I do something like, say the price is 3, the price of pizza is 3, right? Well, you can just kind of say these are the 3 marginal benefits that he gets, because he consumes up, the price of 3 would be between 2 and 4 there. He'll consume up to this point and then stop, right? And those are his marginal benefits. Okay? You can see it on a graph like that. Just adding up rectangles, basically, to get the marginal benefits. So Jacob is my oldest son, and maybe he has friends who are kind of like him. I could do the same thought experiment for his entire class, right, at school. And you know what? I could just sort of throw a price out, let the price of pizza go down, see who bought it, make some inferences about how much they valued pizza, and the result might be something like this, right? I might observe, for example, if I set the price of pizza at 4, if I set it at 10, no one bought pizza. If I set it at 8, 3 people buy pizza, or there's 3 slices sold. If I set it at 6, we get to this 5 here, so on and so forth. But the same principle applies, even though I don't know exactly who the people are, right? I just know that when the price goes down, someone's, an additional slice is sold, someone's marginal benefits are greater than the price when they weren't before, right? If I sell an additional unit. So I can just kind of think about these bars as thinking about someone's willingness to pay for that slice of pizza, right? Okay. So if we wanted to think about, let's suppose I picked a price of 4, right? If I picked a price of 4, well, we could say that would be, breaking a tie, I guess. $3.99, maybe we'll say the price is. Then we would sell 7 pieces of pizza, and we could add up these marginal benefits. Let's see, this is 4 plus 5 plus, this is 5 units high, this is 6 units high, 7, 8, 9, 10. I could do that. That's getting a little tedious, right? But you might notice that there's some geometry emerging from this picture, right? That we're just trying to figure out the area almost under a line up to the point where the price is. Maybe to make this a little bit more concrete, I can tell you this. One of the implications of this is that if we look at this thing, which is kind of our demand curve, what we can do is think about the total satisfaction from the product as everything under the demand curve up to the price that we're talking about. And that's something like the total marginal benefits. I'm going to show you how this works in the next slide, and maybe we can dig into it a little bit. We call this consumer surplus, we call this the total benefits or total satisfaction. When you subtract out what is paid for the pizza, you get consumer surplus. And implicitly, I've been kind of doing this calculation over and over again in class, right? When I say stuff like, I buy a cup of coffee, I value it at $6, I pay $3 for it, right? 6 minus 3 is 3. Uh-oh. I don't know what just happened there. It's always something. Tell me if it comes back on. All right, I got out of full screen. That's not working. Okay, where's the, here we go. Oh, I think I'm getting it. I think I got it. Back on? Thank you. Okay. But now I lost my lecture notes. So okay. Give me a chance to check out this link here. Good. Okay, there's the whole class. All right, so let's just cut to the chase here. And now I'm scared. I'm spooked because I'm afraid I'm going to lose things here. Let's go to a big market, not just Jacob's class, but maybe the entirety of New York City, and we'll think about thousands of pizzas, I guess, not just slices, per day. And we can imagine what the demand looks like in this market. So up until now, we've been talking about this idea that you can read the demand curve here, right? And you could say, all right, well, at a price of 10,000 quantities, 10,000 pizzas are sold in a given day, right? That's fine. But now we have a couple of tools for thinking about the geometry of it all here, right? I can also look at this blue rectangle. It's 10 times 10, I guess 100,000. That would be the total expenditures on pizza during a given day, right? 10 by 10, base times height of a rectangle. Well, I can also look at now we can look at the top, and this is a little bit harder, and we can think about benefits there, right? So I might say this in a slightly different way, because sometimes, ideas are, they resonate a little bit better. If we look at that 15 there, right, the number I've denoted there, 15, what we might observe is that when the price is $15.01 for a pizza, 4,999 units are sold, right? But when the price goes below 15, we sell a 5,000th unit, right? That's not a shocker. That's just reading off the demand curve. That's what that point means. But what we're now saying is that this communicates to us that someone out there values a pizza at right around $15, right? Now, the fact that that person values the pizza at 15 doesn't go away when the price goes to 10, does it? Their valuation is what it is. So, put another way, that green arrow kind of measures how much additional satisfaction that person is getting at a price of 10. Put another way, they're buying a pizza at $10, they value it at 15, right? By the same token, there's someone, our demand curve tells us, who would have paid close to $20 for a pizza, but now they get it at 10, right? This is this notion of buying products because you benefit more than they cost you. Of course, there's also someone who values it right around 10, and someone a little less. They don't buy a pizza at this price. But if we think about all those people who do buy pizzas, and their decisions to buy or not buy those pizzas at different prices, even when the market price is 10, we can still think about their valuations. That's the area, right, captured by that green triangle up there, right? The excess value people get over what they pay. Now, the good news is that's also a simple geometric thing we can calculate. The area of a triangle, the formula is just like the rectangle, base times height, but now you divide by 2, right? And so we can say what we call consumer surplus, what people get from the pizza, less what they pay for it, right? If you want, you can even think about this weird trapezoid from 0 to 20 to 10, 10 to 0, 10. Right? You can think about that as total benefits, and you can think about this as total expenditure. Extract or subtract expenditures from benefits, and you get the green triangle left over. That's the surplus. But you can just calculate it directly as it is, too, right? And in this case, 20 minus 10 means that the height of our triangle is 10. Well, the base is 10 here also. So 10 times 10 gives us 100, divided by 2 gives us 50, or 50,000, right? So what does that mean again? And economists would say, well, when the market price is 10,000 pizzas are sold, and the benefits that consumers realize from buying these pizzas is $50,000, right? Someone might say, well, what do you mean $50,000 in benefits? They spent $100,000 on pizza. The blue, and you're saying, yeah, but we don't care about what they spent. We care about what they get out of it over and above what they spent. That's what the green triangle is, right? Consumer surplus. What you're getting out of something less what you spend for it. And by the way, that's how we can measure what consumers are getting from market participation, right? And the neat thing about it is my long kind of development of this hopefully reveals to you that this is something we get when we are able to figure out what a demand curve looks like, right? It's a consequence of people being rational and revealing their valuation for things by their purchasing decisions, right? By kind of voting with their dollars. That's pretty neat, right? Consumer surplus. So I made another example. I have here on my slides, what about supply? The principle's the same, but you know what? We're getting close to the end, and I kept you a little bit long last time, so let me just do my example here. So, and this idea kind of came to me when thinking about a student's project, which was on bridge crossings and how people change, how the number of people who drive over, say, the GW Bridge changes when you change the toll, right? By the way, this is maybe the very first application of consumer surplus in economics back in the 1840s by a fellow by the name of Jules Dupuy, who observed that you could think about whether or not building bridges was worth it for people based on setting different tolls and seeing how many people crossed. So maybe what we can do is we can say, all right, well, there's a demand curve out there, and maybe it looks like this. So here's $50, and we've decided that almost no one will go across the bridge at a price of $50. But we fiddle around and all that stuff, and we learn that there's all these intermediate prices, and maybe the current price is, I don't know, what is the current price? It's probably like $20. It's a lot. $20. That's about 20. So maybe that's the current price, and I don't know how many people cross the bridge a day. Maybe it's 80,000. So this is a very rough experiment here. And we can do a couple of things with this. Oftentimes in the news, I kind of like this example, because what people talk about, I guess we should have done congestion pricing. Well, whatever. GW Bridge. So in the news, you often hear people make a big deal about this thing down here, right? What is that? Well, that's the total amount people are spending in tolls, right? Every day. And you can calculate this pretty easily. 80,000 times 20, right? And that's what, 160,000? No, it's more than that. 1,600,000? I'm glad. I was about to say you should be able to do calculations in your head like this for the exam because there are no calculators, but of course I just struggled there. Note to self, keep it simple, right? Okay, but we've learned one thing that we might care about as economists is not so much what people are spending to get over the bridge, it's what they're getting out of spending what they're spending to get over the bridge. And we know that to be consumer surplus. So that should be this area up here, right? And, well, let's see here. This distance here is 30. 50 minus 20 is 30. That's the height of our triangle. The base here is still, sorry for my bad handwriting, 80. So what we'd want to do is do 80,000 times 30, right? Is that 2,400,000? Yeah? Nobody's saying yes or no. Am I bungling this? I hope not. I think I got it right. Okay, so we would, and then we would divide that by 2, right? And it kind of checks out. So we'd say that people are realizing something like $1.2 million a day in benefits from crossing the bridge as they spend, right, 1.6 million a day crossing it. And of course, if you wanted to do a little bit of additional thinking about this, you could probably realize that as your demand curve gets flatter, well, the triangle is going to get smaller, right? And as the demand curve gets steeper, well, the triangle is going to get bigger, right? We'll talk more about stuff like that going forward. Let me leave it at that. So we'll talk about supply, I guess, when we reconvene in a week and a half. But look at your email and look at Top Hat, because the exercise that I described in the middle of class will be coming down the pike. And other than that, have a great weekend, and I'll see you